Hi guys, welcome back to this lecture about writing science. This is part 2, where we're going to look at how to write well. So some hints and tips about how to write good science, good coursework, etc. So putting this in context, the first part of the lecture was about the sorts of literature that you're going to encounter as a reader, the different types of papers and books that you might be reading in order to research around your lectures, prepare coursework, etc. And then we talked about the different types of writing that we're going to ask you to do during your studies here at Nottingham. So the next chunk of material, this second part, is about how to write in an appropriate scientific style. There are some guidelines we can give you about the sort of style that we use when we're writing science. We're going to look specifically at some issues about formatting of your text, and then we're going to look at maybe some issues around how to try to improve your English so that you are communicating clearly. So just to remind you where we left off, we were looking at a whole variety of different types of science that you might be asked to write: essays, dissertations, exams, practicals and projects. And all of these require the ability to communicate clearly and to adhere to some basic scientific conventions. So let's have a look at the sort of conventional style that is expected of a scientist. And back in the day, when I was in short trousers, there were really quite rigid expectations of the way that you write in science. Some of those have been relaxed now, which actually potentially causes a bit of confusion because there are some grey areas and some different expectations from different academics, unfortunately. But we can nevertheless still kind of summarise some of the expectations. So typically you're going to write in the past tense. So you're going to be talking about things that have happened in the past rather than things that are happening now or in the future. So if you're writing a practical report or a project, you're going to be talking about the work that you have done in the lab or in the field that generated some interesting data, the analysis that you did with that data, and what you found. It's all about the past. You're not talking about work you're going to be doing in the future generally, although occasionally in the discussion you might do that. In the discussion section of a practical report, you might talk in the present tense about kind of where your current state of knowledge is, having done the work that you've done. And similarly, you might do that when reviewing other people's literature if you're writing an essay or a dissertation. But most of the time, even when you're writing an essay or something like that, you're going to be talking in the past tense about work that has been done in the past. So if you're being asked in an essay to summarise the current understanding of a particular scientific concept, you're going to be looking at the literature on that topic, finding out what people have done, what they've discovered, and then trying to tell us about it in the essay. So you're going to be talking, always looking back to the past. So past tense, generally, if in doubt. Occasionally you might use the present tense or even the future tense if you're writing about stuff that's ongoing. Here's a slightly trickier thing to think about though. Would you be writing in the active voice or the passive voice? And the distinction may not immediately be clear to you, so I'll try and give you an example to explain what I mean. But conventionally in science, we were asked to write in a very sort of dry, conservative way, and so we were typically asked to write in the passive tense. So, for example, baboon bones were studied by the scientist is framed in the passive voice. Did I just call it a tense? Sorry if I did, I meant voice. The alternative way of expressing the same idea in the active voice is to say the scientist studied the baboon bones. So the distinction here is, in green you've got the subject of the sentence, and subject is the thing doing the action when you're writing in the active voice. So the scientist studied the baboon bones, it's the scientist that's doing the studying, and that scientist is the subject of the sentence. In the alternative passive form, baboon bones were studied by the scientist. The baboon bones aren't doing anything in that sentence, but they are nevertheless the subject of the sentence. And it's framing it that way around which gives you this rather dry, conservative style of writing. Baboon bones were studied by the scientist. It's a much more sort of active, engaging way of writing to say the scientists studied the baboon bones. So the question is, which is the right way of doing it in science? And unfortunately the answer is now not so clear as it used to be, because we used to be told keep it dry, keep it conservative, stick to the passive. Nowadays people are becoming more accepting of the active voice, But what I'd ask of you is that you'd be aware of the distinction and think about the impact on your writing. So if you're going to write in the active voice, it is more sort of accessible and probably more enjoyable to read, but there's a danger that it sounds a little bit more informal, and you might find that it tends to make your writing feel less scientific, in inverted commas. There's another distinction to think about here, which is whether you write in the first person or the third person. So those previous examples were both written in the third person. So if we just look at the kind of active form here, we've got I studied baboon bones versus the scientists studied the baboon bones. Now, if you're writing about, I just picked baboon bones because, like, you know, why not? Imagine you were writing a paper about some important study that you'd done looking at baboon bones. If you're writing it as a single person, you know, you're writing up your practical report or project, you know, it is strictly true that it was you that did it. So why not write in the first person, I did it? Again, convention would have taught you to write it in the third person because that was the sort of dry, conservative, scientific style that we used to use. So we would have been, certainly in the past, more likely to write the scientists studied the baboon bones. So you've actually got two sort of related decisions to make here. Should I write in the active voice, and should I write in the first person or the third person? And as I say, nowadays there is no clear, simple answer to this, so I can't tell you, right, go ahead and write in the passive voice third person, which is how we used to do it. Instead, what I would do, again, is to ask you to think about the consequences of writing in these different ways. The third person style, passive style as well, are both sort of considered a bit more conservative and scientific perhaps, but using the first person and the active voice can bring your writing to life to some extent. So I think my overall advice would be to use the first person active with caution, but do use it to make your writing clearer and more direct. But just be aware that you don't want to end up sounding very sort of colloquial or journalistic. And be aware that there will be somewhat different expectations from different people reading your work. I've said here, be consistent. I suppose I don't necessarily mean only writing in either the first person or the third person throughout, but have a strategy. So if we think about first versus third person, a common thing that you might do if you're writing a practical report or a project is to use the first person to emphasize your work in comparison with published work. So for example, in the discussion section of a paper, I mean a project write-up or a practical write-up, you might be talking about the literature that provided the context for your study, and then you might suddenly want to say, yeah, but what I found contrasts with this previous study. And it's at that point that using the first person and maybe the active voice is a good way of emphasizing the fact that this is the kind of active cutting edge of the work that you've done, in contrast with the literature which provides the context. So if after I've said all of this you're now feeling none the wiser as to what style to write in, I think the only, you know, if you only take one thing home from this discussion, I would say it is to be aware that there are different ways of writing and that they're not all the same, even if you're conveying the same factual information. And think about that when you're trying to improve your writing. Okay, we're on to much more stable ground now, because there are a bunch of things that you're expected to do as a scientist when you're writing, and they're just kind of hard and fast rules, and there's no two ways about it. So, for example, Latin names, they are always presented in the same way in science. So whatever you're studying, you're likely to be mentioning the names of species at some point, and so you need to remember this convention. So first of all, here's an example that you all know, Homo sapiens, that's a species. Actually, as is normal, when we're defining a species, we give this binomial. In other words, it's got two parts to the name. The first part is the genus, Homo, and then we have the species name, sapiens. And Homo sapiens is completely typical in that the genus is capitalized and the species is not. And that is how it should always be, whether it's in the middle of the sentence or at the end of a sentence. Always capitalize the genus, never capitalize the species. You may want to mention more than just the genus and the species. So you would never give the species on its own, you'd always give the genus as well. but you might want to give us more information. For example, you might know that humans are in the family Hominidae. So here's the family name, and it is always capitalized, but not in italics. So notice that the binomial genus and species are in italics, and that's how it always must be. But the other Latin names we use for other parts of the taxonomy, like family and order, primata, these are not written in italics, but they are capitalized. And typically, if you want to give the order and the family, you would separate the two with a colon. I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's just convention. So I could, if I was worried that the reader might not know what kind of animal Homo sapiens is, I could say Homo sapiens, and then in brackets I might say primata hominidae. And there I've given 4 pieces of information about what that animal is taxonomically, and to give sort of maximum resolution, if you like. So remember that. The genus and species are always in italics. Genus is capitalized, species is not. Any other information, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, won't be italicized, but it will be capitalized. But when you use the common name for the species, having said that there are no grey areas with this kind of stuff, there is one grey area, and that is, should you capitalize the common or vernacular name for the species, which in this example is the human. The answer is, for something like human, we don't normally capitalize it, but if the species is deemed to be a kind of a single entity, a proper species name, like, I don't know, blackbird, for example, you may see it capitalized, and it actually varies depending on the journal or the kind of publication that you're looking at. Sometimes they will capitalize these names and sometimes they won't, which is a bit annoying as a student because you haven't got a clear-cut rule. So here the rule is be consistent, but what you'll find is academics disagree about this, and I have to confess that my academic next door neighbour in the office next to me, Francis, with whom I have worked for many years and we get on brilliantly, we will argue till the cows come home about whether you should capitalise things. He thinks you should, I think you shouldn't. So the reason I think you shouldn't is because if you think of blackbird, you might think, well, everybody knows what a blackbird is. It's one particular species. Its Latin name is actually Turdus melas. But hang on a minute, there are other things called blackbirds elsewhere in the world. So Americans would call something with a very different Latin name a blackbird. It's a completely different species, not even in the same genus. So when I use the word blackbird, I would argue that I'm not using it to mean one specific taxon. There's some ambiguity about which taxon I'm talking about, and therefore I think it's safest not to use a capital to sort of indicate that it's a descriptive term almost, rather than a very proper noun describing a single thing. I wouldn't worry too much about this. It's kind of dancing on the head of a pin. All you need to do is be consistent. So if you're going to use lowercase for human, use lowercase for mouse and for rabbit and for blackbird as well. That would be my best approach. Okay, but everything else on here is absolutely universal. So just to give you another example, this is a real species. Here's Leucanatcha, is actually a species of braconid wasp. So you're like, well, what's that mean? Because many people won't be familiar with the finer details of the taxonomy of parasitoid wasps. So in this case, for many insects, it would be very sensible to give us the order and the family so that we have some idea of what kind of thing that we're talking about. Because if I just said, here's looking at you, you'd be like, well, what's that? Apart from something with a silly name. The answer is it's a wasp, and the bees, wasps and ants are in the order Hymenoptera, and most biologists would know that even if they'd never heard of this particular species. So telling us that it's Hymenoptera and it's in the family Braconidae is useful. Okay, what else do you need to know about convention? Numbers and units. So there's actually some conventions about how you write numbers in science. So typically, if you've got a number that's up to 10, then you would write it as a word wherever it appeared in the sentence. So you'd write it out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Once you get beyond 10, you typically write it as numerals, like this, 11, 12, 13. The only exception to that is if it's the beginning of a sentence, in which case you typically write it out in words. Another thing worth knowing is if you're writing down parameters like this, like a p-value in statistics, or mu, which could mean the mean of something, for example, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. Typically those parameters are italicized, so we would normally italicize them. you'd normally put a space between a parameter and an operator, like an equal sign or a less than sign, and another space again on the other side before you put the number. So bear that in mind, italics for parameters and spaces where possible. I've just noticed that this number here, 0.01, is actually in italics when it shouldn't be. So that's a mistake I've made on this slide, but you get the idea. Oh, and then another space after the number before you put the units. So it sometimes kind of feels a bit odd putting all these spaces in, but that is the standard way of doing it. Nobody taught me that in many years. I finally learnt it, and then I started doing it, and I thought, oh, that actually looks better. So that's the convention. If you're in any doubt about this sort of thing, about how to present parameters and funny units and things, have a look at a primary scientific paper, and you'll find that they all do it the same. So they all adopt the same convention, despite some of the grey areas I mentioned earlier. Okay, in terms of presenting the document that you're going to perhaps submit for assessment or something like that, you need to make some decisions about how to present, and there's a few basic tips I can give you to make your life easier. So make sure that you choose a nice, large, clear font, okay? So when you're doing it on the printed page, we're talking about 12-point font probably, because it's nice and legible. You might want to sort of perhaps skimp on like using 10-point or 11-point because you're trying to compress it down to get it onto one piece of paper, or maybe even to make it look like you're inside the word limit when you're not. What I would urge you is not to fall into that trap, because there's a couple of problems here. If you use a small font size, then your crusty old lecturer who's got reading glasses and can barely see beyond the end of their nose will struggle to read what you've written. And also struggle to annotate it. There's not much space around the text if it's very small to write on it, if they're marking it by hand, which actually nowadays is relatively rare. And the other thing is, if it looks like you've tried to make it deliberately very small, then we immediately get suspicious and think you're trying to cheat with the word limit. So we might be better or more careful in how we check your word count. Go for lots of space between the lines, or at least 1.5 line spacing, because it helps the person marking the work to annotate it if they're doing it with a pen, or actually with some online annotation mechanisms we use, it's easier if there's more space on the page. It tends to be easy to read as well. Double spacing is probably a bit excessive, so 1.5 is a good bet. And for the same reason, keep your margins nice and large. Don't really narrow your margins right down. Again, people sometimes, when they're trying to make it look like they haven't written as much as they really have, might shrink the margins, but it looks pretty obvious, and it just makes the whole thing a bit more difficult to read. Figures, now when you're using figures, and by which I mean illustrations, images, graphs, that kind of thing, you should have those present embedded in the text rather than sort of put separately at the end of your document, which some people might be tempted to do, but have them at the right point. So you should always mention a figure if you're going to put it in the text, and the figure should appear after the paragraph in which it's first mentioned. And don't try and sort of squidge it in alongside the text. Put it below the paragraph in which it's mentioned. And use page numbers. You can add page numbers easily in Microsoft Word or other word processors, and it helps your assessor know where they are in the document, or if they want to refer back and say, oh, this is different from what you said on page 3, page numbers can be useful. And just be a bit careful with colour, because I think it's tempting to use like really nice colourful graphs and pictures and things in your documents, but just bear in mind that if you've got to print a hard copy at the last minute, colour printing seems to go wrong about 90% of the time. So if you don't really need the colour and you know you've got to print it out, that might not be a great decision. But to be honest, nowadays you very rarely do have to print stuff out for assessment. The other reason for being a bit careful with colour is it's going to look different on different people's screens. So if you choose, funky but subtly different shades of colour which you think look beautiful, they may not be as clear on somebody else's dodgy laptop at the other end of Nottingham. So what I would recommend you do is use colour for scientific purposes, to make, to emphasise things, to distinguish between things. Don't use it just to look pretty, in case you fall into that trap. Okay, so the last bit of this part of the lecture is to think about English, because science is pretty much useless if you aren't actually conveying that science to somebody. So having the ability to communicate science clearly in writing turns out to be really, really important. And it's weird because, I mean, most of us don't go into science because we really like English. I mean, I kind of like reading and stuff, but it's not my main strength. It's not why I became a scientist. And yet, actually, all of us have to do this. And it's critical because you might as well have not done the science if you can't communicate it to anybody. So it does matter. Like, we have to live with that. So what can you do to help? Well, I mean, there are some obvious things. Modern software is brilliant at helping you along the way. So if Microsoft Word is putting squiggly things, green or red squiggly lines underneath your text, then that normally means something. And if you might get into the habit of kind of ignoring it, but maybe stop and have a look, because it might be that you are consistently spelling something wrong, or it might be that that grammar recommendation it's making is helpful. Not everything that Microsoft Word suggests is right or appropriate for the circumstances. And indeed, of course, in science, you might be using species names that Word has never heard of, and occasionally using grammatical constructions that are not familiar to Word. Word is primarily written by Americans, so it has some peculiar sort of pseudo-grammatical rules which don't actually really apply to English, but for the most part, it's pretty accurate. But obviously you can do better than that. You can read the stuff yourself, and crucially you can get other people to proofread it. So if it's a really important document, maybe an important piece of coursework, never hurts to get somebody else, even if they know nothing about the subject, to have a look at your writing, to read it through, because they will spot errors that you don't spot, because your brain will kind of fill in the gaps. It will assume that it knows what it's about to read, even if you're really trying hard to concentrate and proofread yourself. If you do want to proofread yourself, and I recommend strongly that you do always read back stuff that you've written, then a good tip to avoid that problem of your brain filling in the gaps is to read it out loud. So actually read the text word for word out loud. You may feel like a bit silly for doing it, but believe me, you will spot errors that way that you wouldn't spot if you were just reading inside your head. So give it a shot and you'll be surprised how much of an improvement it makes. Another thing to do is to take account of what people write on your work. You will find that lecturers, your tutor, will annotate documents that you submit. It might be on Turnitin, which is one of the systems we use for marking, or it might be in Moodle, or it might be in Ink. But if there's a little squiggle or a little comment or some kind of abbreviation or something, it probably means something. And so ask yourself, what's it mean? What have I done wrong, or how could I improve? How could I fix this issue? And if you can't understand it, if, as may be the case, your tutor has illegible handwriting, or they've written something kind of technical and you don't understand what the criticism is, they won't mind if you ask them. So just ask them to clarify what it is you mean. But take notice of that, because that feedback, it may be very small things, just circling your commas or something, and you might think, oh yeah, I probably got the punctuation wrong. Well, take that in hand and have a look and see how you could improve your punctuation. You might think it's trivial, you're here to do biology, not English, but actually it really matters. Okay, you'll get more advice about some of the sort of finer arts of scientific writing, both on Moodle, and Caroline's provided some resources in the Core Skills Moodle page, and also in later years actually. There are skills modules for all of the degrees, I think in second year, and all of them involve to some extent thinking about writing. But if I had to give you just one tip to improve your English, to improve your written English particularly, it would be to read, because by reading you magically get better at writing without having to think about it. And what's more, you have fun along the way. Okay, so I read for pleasure. I don't read science outside work time. I lie in the bath and read science fiction, or I read interesting novels from the 19th century. I read anything, to be honest. It doesn't have to be high quality fine fiction. It could be a magazine, it could be the internet, it could be a Mills and Boon novel. But if you read, and hopefully read lots and read variety, you will improve in your ability to communicate across the board, both in spoken and in written English, magically, without having to do any work. Just enjoy the text for what it is and you will get better. And I have found this, I'm still getting better, and I'm, whatever it is, too old to count. It's a very slow process improving from what is already an excellent level of English that you all must have in order to be here. Even if it's not your first language, you will be operating at a very high level in a very complex skill, which is English. But you can get better, and you can get better by reading. So if you're thinking now, yeah, I don't like reading, it's boring, don't like books, whatever, fine. Find something you do enjoy reading. Try something different. There's a million different types of reading to be done out there. If you haven't picked up a book for 20 years, no, not 20 years in your case, 5 years, pick one up, find something different, try a different genre, something that you weren't forced to read at school, and try reading out loud to each other. I do that all the time. I mean, it's a bit sad, but I read to my wife in the bath, and it's brilliant. I read to my kids, and my kids are getting quite old now, but we still enjoy reading to each other. Reading out loud actually is incredibly good for your ability to communicate. So give it a crack, don't be shy about it, and you will get better. I think that's the end of this part. So I will stop here and I'll start another part shortly.